Good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading the book written by Frank Peake titled The Bishop Who Ate His Boots, a biography of Bishop Isaac O. Stringer. And we'll pick up from where we left off last week. During the Stringers' first full year of residence on Herschel Island in 1897 to 1898, there were about 50 white men and more than 100 Eskimos from half a dozen different tribes. Sunday services were held for both whites and Eskimos and were reasonably well attended. Evening classes were held for the whites and a day school organized for the Eskimos. The latter had an average attendance of 30 people, both adults and children. A singing practice once a week gave the whalers an opportunity for a social evening, which all seemed to enjoy. The presence of the white men for the winter was quite unexpected, due to the fact that two of the whalers, the sailing vessel Wanderer and the steamship Mary D. Hume, had been unable to penetrate the ice brought by the early winter, and had been compelled to turn back to Herschel Island. As Mrs. Stringer commented, "They came to us a sad lot of men, expecting to get to San Francisco and then having to spend another winter in the north." The missionaries felt it their duty to help entertain these unwilling sojourners, and in addition to services and social evenings, Mrs. Stringer offered a shorthand course to any who might be interested. Actually, her husband made the offer and then told his wife what he had done. 5 men availed themselves of the opportunity and became reasonably proficient. Mrs. Stringer remarked with satisfaction afterwards that having graduated from the Stringer Shorthand School at Herschel Island, they were able to give up whaling and obtain clerical positions in San Francisco. At the end of May 1898, the Stringers started out once again with a party of Eskimos for Fort McPherson. The snow was soft and the traveling heavy, but within a week they were at Shingle Point, where they exchanged their dog sleds for a boat stored there. They reached Peel River about the middle of June, and were greeted by Whitaker and others. The Eskimos had not yet come up the river from Kizigazuk. The gold rush of the closing years of the 19th century brought an increasing number of miners and prospectors to Alaska and the Yukon. Most of them traveled by ship to Dia and over the Chilkat Pass. A few went to St. Michael in the Northern Sound and up the Yukon River. Some went overland by way of the Telegraph Trail through to British Columbia. And there were others who went down the Mackenzie River intending to cross the mountains to Dawson City in the Klondike. The mid-July steamer brought in addition to the bishop, the chief factor, J.S. Campbell, Emma Hatley, Whitaker's fiancée. Next morning, Whitaker was ordained to the priesthood. Stringer preached the sermon and presented the candidate. Then the bishop continued with the ordination. In the afternoon, Whitaker's marriage to Miss Hatley took place, followed by a wedding party. A few days later, the steamer left. The Stringers packed their belongings and set off once more for Herschel Island. They took with them, quote, a Mr. Mitchell who came from Rat River and wanted to go to Herschel Island to get home to Montreal as he had been sick, unquote. As they reached the island on August 17th, happy to be home again and happy to find out that Will Young had managed the affairs of the mission very well in their absence. In addition to the whalers and Eskimos, there were also a number of would-be miners on the island, most of them hoping to get a passage out on one of the ships. By the beginning of September, both the ships and the miners had gone, with a single exception of the Mary D. Hume, under Captain Haggerty, which was to remain for the winter. The next few weeks were spent getting ready for the bad weather which lay ahead. Stringer and Young made some necessary repairs to the house. They piled an ample pile of coal where it would be handy for use. The whaling ship made several trips to the mainland for firewood, and the officers were busy putting their houses into shape. The missionary work was also continued, although the population was greatly reduced. Eskimo services each Sunday had a congregation of between 20 and 30, while the white services usually had about a dozen people present. In all probability, it would never have occurred to the missionaries of that day to hold integrated services for whites and Eskimos, and almost certainly the white whalers would have resented the suggestion. Moreover, there was a language problem. Few of the Eskimos could understand English, and certainly would feel more at home in a service conducted in their own language, even though Stringer, at this time, was dependent upon an interpreter. As soon as the more pressing preparations for the winter had been completed, the missionaries opened a day school for the natives. At the beginning of November, Stringer left the school to the care of his wife and Will Young, and set out with another man named Pedersen from the Mary D. Hume. Pedersen was off to Kizigazuk to buy meat. They took 2 dog sleds and were assisted by 3 Eskimos. Near K Point, they left the Eskimos in camp and walked up to a log house where they found 4 gold seekers spending the winter. They were streetcar employees from Chicago and hoped to get into the valley between the Richardson and Buckland Mountains, where they had heard that the gold had been found for 2 years previous. As the next day was Sunday, Stringer held a service with them in the afternoon, and then, on the following morning, walked back with Pedersen to where they had left the Eskimos. 10 days later, they passed Tunisakak, an Eskimo settlement. When they reached Kizigazuk, only Tokogak and his family were there. As they were about to leave, Stringer and Pedersen went on with them to the Eskimo village of Naputalik, where there were several other families. Pedersen found that the meat was scarce and only able to buy 1 saddle of caribou and about 140 fish. The travelers now came back to Tukiyuktuk, where there was an Eskimo settlement. Stringer held a service in the evening, then went inland to visit other Eskimo families. On his return to Tukiyuktuk, he found that Takochikina had arrived with news that caribou had been reported to the east. Rather than pursue it, they continued their journey to the west, but not before Koklik had arrived and further services had been held. After their 40-day trip, they were back at Herschel Island on December 10th. The missionaries always suffered a degree of competition from the native shamans and medicine men. In cases of illness, these Eskimo doctors always insisted on their own remedies, and these were equally insistently rejected by white men without any thought that they might have some virtue, however slight. Sometimes these Eskimo treatments were based upon sound common sense, but for the most part they seemed to the white men to be unreasonable and preposterous. On one occasion, the Stringers took a sick Eskimo named Okpik into their house to protect him from the attentions he would otherwise have received from the shamans. It seemed certain to the medicine men that Okpik was fatally ill. His parents were willing enough at first to accept their diagnosis and to follow their directions, but after a time they turned to the missionaries. Stringer quickly discovered not only that their living quarters were cold and damp, but they did not administer the medicines as he had directed. Moreover, the parents were still very much under the influence of the shamans. For days the boy hovered between life and death, while the shamans gloated. If he died, any hope of influence the missionaries might have would be at an end. If he died under their roof, no native would ever enter the house again. Anxiously they watched, waited, and nursed him. Slowly he began to mend, and within 5 or 6 weeks he was able to go home. A few days after that he was out on a hunting expedition with no apparent ill effects. This was the turning point. Not only had Okpik's life been saved, but the other Eskimos were willing to believe that the missionaries might be able to help them. A similar instance in which the Stringers were able to save a life occurred some time afterwards. An Eskimo named Tunguk had returned to Herschel Island in starving condition, and reported that he had left his mother in a snow house about 25 miles back, with no fire and only a small piece of whale meat. This was a common method of disposing of the aged, and Tunguk thought that by this time she would be dead. The missionary persuaded an Eskimo to accompany him, and together they went at once to rescue the deserted woman. When they reached the spot, they heard a voice calling faintly from within the snow house. On entering, they found the old woman, about 70 or 80 years of age. Before taking her back to Herschel Island, they lit a fire and gave her food. When she discussed the ordeal afterwards, she reported that someone had come to her twice at night and given her food, but this was thought to have been a dream. At the end of May, the Stringers left Will Young to care for the mission, and set out by dog sled and boat for Fort McPherson, arriving on June 17, 1899. Here, in addition to the natives, they found a number of miners waiting for the annual steamer. They were sorry to learn also of the recent death from cancer of George Greenland, who had been Stringer's interpreter when he first went among the Eskimos. Stringer discovered also that Whittaker had acquired a small steamer. None of the diaries or letters say anything about it, or how it was obtained. They say only that it was in good running order and was named the Messenger. It is probable that Whittaker bought it on behalf of the mission from one of the prospectors and renamed it. The bishop came on the Wrigley for his annual visit to Fort McPherson, and with him Archdeacon MacDonald returning from his furlough. During this visit, what appears to have been the first confirmation at the mission was held on July 14th. 34 Lacroix Indian candidates were presented by Archdeacon MacDonald and confirmed by the bishop. Among them were Amos Nujul, Julius Kendi, both of whom were later ordained. During July, the Stringers' 3-year-old daughter, Rowena, became ill and feverish with whooping cough, causing great anxiety to her parents. By the beginning of August, however, she had recovered sufficiently for them to set out for Herschel Island, but since it had grown so late in the season, they thought it well not to call it Kizigazuk. Instead, Stringer and his family, and Whittaker, with some others, set out from Fort McPherson in the little steamer on August 3rd. To their delight, they completed the 300-mile voyage, which usually took 2 weeks, in little less than 60 hours of actual running time. They had thought of keeping the vessel at Herschel Island, but when Whittaker's supplies arrived from San Francisco in one of the whaling ships, they were more than the mission whaleboat could carry. He had therefore to load them into a steamer and take them back to Peel River. Unfortunately, the work at Herschel Island did not live up to its early promise. The whaling industry declined, and after 1899, few whalers came into the harbor during the summer, and none remained for the winter. The missionaries were left alone with a handful of quarrelsome Eskimos. There were a number of incidents during this time, and some of them have been preserved only as family tradition. One of these tells of an Eskimo woman who came running to the mission house at Herschel Island, followed by her husband, who was brandishing a large knife. Without betraying any surprise, the missionary strode up to the angry Eskimo and sternly demanded, "What are you doing like this at my house?" Unquote. Shamefaced and confused, the Eskimo replied that his wife had refused to mend his boots, and he intended to punish her. Stringer ordered him from the house, and without a word he meekly turned and went. The woman remained until her husband's anger had subsided. Another story tells of how an oblate priest and lay brother stayed with the Stringers for a time. They had presumably come to Herschel Island to get their supplies from the whaling ship, and had to wait until it arrived. The Stringers, always warmly hospitable, entertained them and took care of them until they were able to go on their way. In appreciation of this kindness, they gave Mrs. Stringer some beaver pelts, which she was able to have made into a fur coat, which she wore for many years. In addition to the ordinary vicissitudes of life, at such a remote station, the snow blindness which had plagued Stringer grew worse. It became so acute that for days at a time he could do no reading at all. At one point he feared he would not be able to complete his term of service. Moreover, it was not long before the bright glare of sun on the snow began to impose a strain on Mrs. Stringer's sight as well. Altogether, the remainder of the term at Herschel Island was discouraging, to say the least. Early in 1900, Stringer received word from the bishop that at the request of the Canadian Church Missionary Association, he was granting him a furlough for the coming year. This was later postponed to 1901. Their second child, Frederick Herschel, was born on May 25, 1900, with no more medical assistance than the anxious father could supply. Shortly after the baptism of Herschel Stringer, as he was always known, the missionary set out for Peel River. It was a trip he would gladly have avoided, since he was reluctant to leave his family at such a critical time, even though they had the capable help of Will Young. If they were to get their letters to Fort McPherson to be taken out on the Wrigley, and to receive their letters and supplies when the steamer brought them in, the trip was essential. In addition, he had undertaken to take the mail from the whaling ships. There seemed to be no way of avoiding the journey, and the missionary and his wife agreed that he must go. As on previous occasions, the first part of the journey was by dog sled, and at Shingle Point they transferred their luggage to a whaleboat. The dogs were sent back to the island. And we'll stop there for this week, and we'll pick up next week with Chapter 5, Part D. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.